queue right now, Ellen and Emily and Fortunat. And we're just moving you over. So Emily, Ellen, let's see. Close the chat for a minute. Hello, Heather. Hi, Emily. Nice to see you again.
Hello.
Fortunat, nice to see you. Hey, Ellen. Okay, who are we missing? We've got George O'Keefe, Town of Brumford. Nice to meet you. Caitlin, Hollinger Blue Wave. Nice to meet you. Let's see. Matt Kearns, do we have him yet? No, I'm not seeing him yet. Jeremy Payne, not yet. Andy Smith, not yet. Julie Ann Smith, not yet. Allie, hi. Tell us about you. I don't have you on a list. Tell me about you. Are you able to unmute?
Sorry, was that Allie that you said?
Yes. How are you?
Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Allie. I'm an intern this summer with the Governor's Energy Office. I'll be working with Selena and Ethan. It's nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you too. Okay, let's see. We'll wait a couple more minutes for, we've got Andrew Smith. You go by Andy? Okay. Nice to meet you. And no Jeremy yet. So have I missed either Matt Kearns, Jeremy Payne, or Julianne Smith? Any of those? Okay.
That's on his way over.
Matt is?
I'm
Okay,
here.
great. Hi, Matt.
Hi. Sorry to be a couple minutes late.
It's okay. It's okay this time.
My executive committee, same thing. Give one chance.
Okay, I think we're going to get going. I think if I'm understanding correctly, we're missing Jeremy and Julianne, and hopefully they'll be joining us soon. And we've got Commissioner Beal on the line as well. So hello, everyone. My name is Jody Sapphire. I've been hired to facilitate your work over the next 6-ish months. And I'm really excited to work with all of you and just want to thank you for the time that you're committing to this process. It's no small thing to be taking many hours of every one of your months for the next 6 months for a really important effort to try to advance 2 really important objectives that the state has, which is to protect prime farmland and soils of statewide importance, farmland, land of statewide importance, and to advance solar energy production to the greatest extent possible. And those objectives can be in conflict with one another, but need not be. And so I think the point here is to try to have all of you collectively identify a path forward that will maximize those 2 objectives and minimize negative impacts. To start out, I just want to let everyone know that we are in recording mode, and all meetings will be recorded right from the start, so that any of you, as I need to pull sort of salient pieces and conclusions that you've come to, and also members of the public can refer back to and hear what's going on. So these meetings will always be recorded. I'll just do a quick high-level overview of what we'll be covering today, and then I'm going to turn it over to the commissioner and the 2 co-chairs to sort of provide some introductory remarks, and then we'll just dig in. But if I were to try to just say really succinctly what I think today is about, it's about really developing a body of shared knowledge. And the start of that was to try to provide you with some advanced reading materials to get all of us on the same page of a basic level of understanding of what these issues are. And then together, the majority of today's meeting will be sort of co-developing your focus and charge for the next 6 months. So what you've seen in your packet, particularly in some of the early pages 5 through 7, is sort of an outline of where the organizers, the co-chairs and their staff have thought might be the best direction to go. But the point of today is to really get your feedback. What's missing in that? What may be the right areas to concentrate on more than others? So that's the overarching objective. You'll hear presentations from 2 entities, from the Governor's Energy Office and from the Audubon. And then the rest of the agenda is a little bit squishy. There is some time, the time allocations listed, but we'll probably shift them a little bit and allow for open conversation amongst all of you about the direction of this group's work. At every meeting, there'll be the opportunity for public comment, though that will probably occur right toward the end of each meeting, so that the public can kind of respond to where you're headed, where it looks like you're headed from that day's work. And then we'll have some time to sort of tee up what would be the best use of your time for the next meeting, given that it's only 3 weeks away, which is a little bit shorter than probably the distance between most of your meetings. And then you'll have the opportunity to just provide feedback on the structure of the meeting. Is it structured the way you like? And just critical feedback about that, which will be really helpful moving forward. So I'm happy to just take any really quick questions about the plan. And what we'll do, I think, to start is, even as stakeholder group members, we'll start out by using a raise hand function, since there's a fair number of you, and then we can call on you to talk as you like. So if any questions about what I just mentioned, feel free to raise your hand about that. And otherwise, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Beal to provide some opening remarks. Hello.
Hi, thank you, Jody. Yeah, I just want to start out by echoing Jody's appreciation that she expressed for all of you for taking the time. This is an important conversation, and we're really, really glad that you all were willing to commit to it. And I'm not going to take too long in my opening remarks here, because you have a lot to talk about. And I also just want to thank Nancy and Selena for co-chairing this stakeholder work group, and Jody for being willing to facilitate. I know there's going to be a lot of really good thinking and some helpful recommendations that are going to come out of this work. So I did want to just kind of preface this by saying that, we, the department, obviously the administration, we're very pro renewable energy. We are excited to see the kind of energy around development of, solar and other types of renewable energy initiatives that are popping up. And so with that, this discussion also is important, because we know that we really value our farmland, and we know that our good agricultural soils are a finite resource, and we want to protect those as well. And we do recognize that a lot of the pressure that we're seeing in terms of interest in solar development is being directed toward existing farmland. We've also learned from what's happened in other states that if there are not any kind of guardrails or incentives to steer people to other types of locations, that farmland can be greatly impacted. And so we want to be proactive about this. We don't want to make trade-offs that limit our opportunities in other ways. As we discussed in the Natural and Working Lands Work Group for the Climate Council, our working farmland is a really important tool in our climate change, sort of response. And for mitigation. We know that agriculture is part of the solution, and we want to be able to maximize all opportunities that are out there. And we also recognize that having the opportunity to be part of solar development can be a really important income generating opportunity for farmers, and we want to support that as well. And with that, you have a big charge here, a lot of different layers to this conversation. I feel like it's in really good hands with you all. And I know that Nancy's going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that we've been doing as a department, sort of to be proactive and provide resources to help people make good decisions on the ground. So I will leave it there and just again say thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I know that you are probably not able to stay with us, and so wish you good luck as the legislature continues on with its work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Nancy, would you like to speak next, and then we'll turn it after you to Selena.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy Mcbrady. I'm the Bureau Director here at the Bureau of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Resources. We are one of 4 bureaus within the Department of Agriculture. And not surprisingly, my remarks really do mirror a lot of what Commissioner Beal just said, in that our department is, of course, very supportive of the state's energy goals, while also being vigilant in wanting to maintain viable and productive farmland throughout the state. We obviously recognize that solar energy is a benefit to the state of Maine, but we also have to recognize that productive ag soils and other valuable natural resources are limited, and it's very important for us to find a path that is cognizant of both of those realities as we move forward. As Commissioner Beal also said, renewable energy offers a really important economic diversification for income for some landowners and farmers, and we want to also recognize the importance of that. So finding the right policies and incentives and parameters to help move Maine forward is really critical. The Bureau to date has taken a number of steps to enter this conversation about right-sized or thoughtful solar development and location. And to that end, if you haven't already visited our webpage at the Bureau, we certainly encourage you to do that, and we can put that in the chat along the way today. Our webpage includes a lot of useful technical resources, as well as 2 guidance documents that we developed ourselves. One includes a technical guidance for utility scale solar installations and development on ag, forested, and natural lands. And that's meant for both the development community as well as the landowner community. And it was crafted with the insight of both. And so we're hopeful that that, at the very least, is very useful at the get-go. And we also want to recognize that MFT and Maine Audubon, IFNW, others out there have also established their own type of guidance. So we have a rich environment from which to pull and have this conversation. So the department, again, is very excited to engage with the key stakeholders, the technical experts who we will invite to participate along the way, and of course the public, to have a thoughtful and thorough conversation about this interesting situation that we're in right now. I also want to quickly acknowledge the help and assistance of Yvette Mounier from the Bureau. She's on today. She helped organize the stakeholder effort. She was instrumental in our ACF guidance, maintains our webpage. And if anyone has any questions throughout all of this, I certainly encourage you to reach out to her. Thank you, Jody, for being here and helping with your facilitation, and to my colleagues from the Governor's Energy Office. We're really excited to have you. So with that, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have a thoughtful conversation over the next number of months, and I appreciate your time going forward.
Thank you, Nancy. Selena, go right ahead.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everyone in addition to Amanda and Nancy and Jody, but I know that right now in particular is a really busy time with the legislature in session and other things going on. So I recognize that this is a significant amount of time that you're investing here, and we really do appreciate the engagement. My name is Selena Cunningham. I'm the Deputy Director at the Governor's Energy Office. And the Governor's Energy Office is working to advance energy solutions for Maine, grow Maine's clean energy economy, and work to address climate change. And we work to make sure that Maine people have reliable and affordable energy. And so we certainly appreciate partnering with the Department of Agriculture on this effort, because we do believe that it's possible to strike the right balance in terms of continuing growth of the burgeoning solar industry and support the policy objectives set by the Department of Agriculture to conserve prime farmland and soils of statewide significance. And that my hope is that we could use the next 6 months to have a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing agricultural landowners and the solar industry, to put forward clear direction and strategies and recommendations to find that right balance. And we won't solve all of it in this time period, but I think we'll make a significant progress, and then figure out how we can continue to work together going forward in the future, recognizing that this is a long-term relationship between these two sectors. And so again, I appreciate your time. And I also want to thank Ethan Tremblay, our solar and storage analyst in the Governor's Energy Office. He's the staff member on for this effort and has been really helpful in putting things together, and will be a contact throughout this process.
Awesome. Thank you both. And I see that we have Julianne has joined us, and feel free to turn on your video if you're comfortable doing that, just so that we all meet you. And if you're not able to right at this moment, that's fine too. But let me know if you'd like to be referred to as Julianne or Julie. And so I think all we're missing is, we don't have Jeremy, is that correct? And he wasn't sure actually if he was going to be able to make it to this meeting. So I think that's all that we're missing, the only individual that we're missing right now. So anyway, okay, so why don't we get underway? The first meetings are always what I would say is a little bit clunky. We don't know one another. We're developing norms of working together. We have to take care of some administrative stuff to figure out how to work together. And so there'll be a little bit of that. Hopefully, I think the majority of this meeting you'll find engaging and an opportunity for learning, and also weighing in and providing your opinions on things. Just to kick off, I will say that for public members who are on the line, we really appreciate your level of interest. We don't have your video showing just so that we can see one another as stakeholder group members, but there will be the opportunity to weigh in later in the meeting. I didn't think to mention this in my cover email when I sent out meeting materials, but I will be referring to them frequently throughout your time together this morning, and referring to them by page number. So whether you prefer to have a printout of that or split screen or something so that you can be referring to some of the documents in real time, that would be helpful. As I mentioned, we'll be using the raise hand function for now so that I can sort of take all of your comments in order when we start having a conversation. If by the end of the meeting that just felt awkward, you can let me know and we can do something different for the next meeting. And then if there are things that feel relevant to the conversation that don't necessarily need to be spoken, but that you'd like folks to be made aware of that, please make use of the chat function. We'll save the chat, get it printed out, and if there are resources that are noted in there that it looks like it makes sense to make sure you have for the future meetings, we'll be sure to get those to you. If you were able to turn to page 3 in your meeting materials, and this was the draft ground rules, and I have found that if I'm a participant in a process, I often look at ground rules and roll my eyes and then ignore them and think that they're not relevant. And in a facilitator role, I feel the exact opposite. I think they're super helpful to help you do your best work together. And it's sort of, it's not just about, being polite. I expect all of you to probably disagree really strongly on some issues, and I encourage that level of conversation. But But in terms of making best use of your time and being most efficient with it, I think this is a reasonable starting point. And what I'd like to do is just go through them quickly and then get your perspective on, are there things that you feel very strongly about should not be in here or that you think are missing? And then we'll just see if we can have a list that we agree on and move forward. And we'll be reminded of those at future meetings. So I do start and end meetings on time. You can feel confident that if this meeting ends at noon, that you could schedule something at 12:05 at the next for the next meeting. And by starting on time, it just means that we'll make the best use of your time together. I assume that whatever is sent out to you will have been read in advance. And so we won't waste your time during the meeting reviewing what you've already been given. There will usually be a lot of conversation about what you were given, with the understanding that you've already consumed it and may already have, hopefully, opinions about it or different perspectives on it. So if you could, and I will try to estimate the amount of time that I think it will take to get through those meeting packets in advance. Being present and engaged simply means what I think you know it means, which is not checking your email or looking at Facebook at the same time, that we have your undivided attention for this period of time, and know that you're sort of on your game and you're listening and you're just ready to respond to what other folks are thinking. There are people who are internal processors and people who are external processors. And if you could all just be aware of that if you tend not to speak very often, we want to know what you think. And if you tend to speak a lot, we want to know what other people think too, and to have some level of consciousness around that so everyone's participating. In situations where I think there will be pretty divergent perspectives, I would simply invite you to really listen more deeply when you hear something that you don't agree with, to try to figure out why it is that another smart person thinks something substantially different than you. And so that we can continue to develop shared understanding and ultimately, ideally, end up with some recommendations that are a consensus from all of you. There are always processes that don't allow for unanimity, but to the extent that we can have a document at the end that is your unanimous opinion, all the better. So that's what I'll be working on, trying to get you to that point. And then you probably will only have 6, maybe 7 meetings together. So constantly thinking about how to problem solve in a productive manner in that period of time. It's a complicated issue. You're not going to solve every problem, but what can you solve during this period of time? A reminder that meetings and materials are public, comments are on the record, and so just share your thoughts with that understanding. And then finally, while I do like to make sure that we have sort of strict sideboards around how efficient we're being and the time that we're taking up, I do want you to have fun. And I hope that by the end of this process, you know one another better, you like one another, and you're willing to joke with one another about a serious topic. So any reactions to that, things that you don't like in there or that you think are missing, and just feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. Okay. All right, so if you could just actually physically raise your hand if you're comfortable proceeding with these ground rules. Okay. All right, perfect. Thank you all for indulging me with that. And so what I think we'll turn to then is brief introductions from each of you. If you want to turn to page 4, the membership of the group is listed. It's essentially in alphabetical order by last name, with the co-chairs first, and then stakeholders, and then staff, and then myself. And I think if we just went down in that order, and what I was going to ask each of you to do, because I'm guessing that many of you don't know each other, is to just 1 minute or less. This is brief. It's not giving a family history. It's more about a thumbnail sketch of your either exposure to, or your understanding of, or your experience with the intersection of agriculture and solar energy production. And it's really just to help the rest of the group say, what are these areas of expertise that are going to be really helpful for us to be able to draw on over the course of the next many meetings. So what's the knowledge and experience in the room that we can draw on? So could I put you on the spot, Selena, and ask you to just give that a go first? And then we'll just go, I won't call on you, you'll just go down the line from the order that's on that page 4.
Can you tell me again? I'm sorry.
No problem. A thumbnail sketch of either your exposure to, or your understanding of, or your experience with the intersection of agriculture and solar energy production. So you may know a ton about solar energy that has nothing to do with agriculture, but we want to just sort of get a sense of that nugget where you've been working on, or you know something about, or you don't, and you want to know more about. Just, it's the intersection that we care about of agriculture and solar energy production.
Great, thank you. In my experience, I've worked on some state policies outside of Maine and looked at different land use and solar policies from individual companies and how they go about it. But I think what I'm looking forward to learning more is specifically in Maine, what the experience is for agricultural landowners and solar companies. So have a broader perspective, but want to learn specifically about Maine.
Thank you. Nancy?
Likewise, the interactions that I've personally had have been in engaging on particular issues or conundrums that arise with solar development and agriculture, whether or not dual use might be appropriate at a site, or whether or not solar grazing might be appropriate at a site. My impression is that there are many developers who are very interested in trying to thoughtfully and appropriately integrate development on agricultural land, which I find very reassuring. But I do think that this stakeholder group offers a very good opportunity to test that and really drill down into opportunities as well as challenges.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. Nick, would you like to go? Yeah, there you go.
Sure. So I have a farm down in Lemon, York County, and I was actually coming back from Rangeley and drove by the large installation in Farmington, Sandy River Farms, Bussy York's operation, and I was a bit alarmed. I hadn't been paying attention. So I started knocking on doors and researching, and along the way had the opportunity to get some good support and information from Ellen and Nancy here. And I also learned a little bit about the American Solar Grazing Association, and we keep sheep on our farm, and I'm a domestic wool industry veteran. So I'm fairly interested in sheep and grazing animals as a resource management tool, and targeted grazing as a solution to vegetative management. And I see there's an opportunity with solar and renewable energy here in Maine and New England to really be a potential solution to some of our climate crisis. But I think for certain that there has to be a lot of thoughtful time and consideration put in that process. So I'm delighted to be part of the group here, and really impressed with the individuals that have been brought together, and look forward to learning quite a bit. Thanks.
Super helpful. Thank you, Nick. All right, I'm going to call each person's name out. Emily, go ahead, right? Just so you don't need to.
So I'm from American Farmland Trust, and my experience actually started back in 2012, 2013, when I was at UMass getting my doctorate in soil science, and they have the first sort of small dual use array there. And I did some planting and some collecting of peppers and tomatoes and sampling way back when, and then forgot about it. Went off to do other things. And when I came to AFT 2 years ago, I actually came in, and part of my work was to lead our regional smart solar siting partnership project for New England, where we worked with some great partners to evaluate policies, including looking at dual use as a potential way to integrate solar and agriculture together. I'm also, because I'm a soil scientist, I'm also more involved in some of the actual data collection around projects. I'm involved with a DOE funded project with UMass and the Mass Department of Ag, and several developers and farmers that will be looking at arrays with various types of agriculture, from hay production to poultry grazing and other types of grazing and actual vegetable production. So beyond that, I'm also working with the American Solar Grazing Association, Lexi Hain, on another sheep grazing research project in New York. Again, sort of looking at the soil impacts there. So I see there's a real great opportunity here. And I think that it's something that with good policies and policies that shape good design around solar, that dual use is one way to help us meet energy needs and protect our agricultural economy. And I think that I look at it from 2 points, from the, protect our farmers and our economy, but also from what can we do and how can we really benefit and add soil health and other climate mitigation processes on site simultaneously. And so I really see a lot of potential here. But I'm also very, very cautious and aware that we need really good policies to shape that well.
Awesome. Thank you. Heather, go right ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. My name is Heather Donahue. My husband, Doug, and I have Balfour Farm in Pittsfield. We're an organic dairy farm. We've been here for about 11 years since in December, it'll be 11 years since we moved to Maine. And we are a little bit unique in that we are an off the grid. We're not grid tied at all, and we rely on solar power for probably 85% of the power on the farm. We do use a diesel generator for when we're milking and have heavy load times. And we've done that since 2019. So we're very engaged on the farming aspect of solar, as well as the practical aspect of using systems. The other thing that's kind of unique in our position is that I serve on our municipal town council. And as a municipal officer, I'm interested in learning more about the policies that are being developed statewide. We do have a large solar array here in Pittsfield that was sited on some agricultural land, as well as some forest land that was claimed for that project. And then we have 3, possibly 4 more projects in our town that are moving forward through our planning board. So I'm very much feeling the pressure on farmland because it's nice open land. It's easy to develop, and I'm interested in hearing the voices on developing the policies and making sure that the farmer aspect is definitely carried through to the policies that are made, as well as the information that's going to the legislature when they're making rulemaking for things like this. So thank you for allowing me to be on the panel, and I apologize if I have to pop in and out. I finally found someone to staff our farm store, and today's our first day of training, so I might have to kind of not be as engaged as I'd like to be today. But I didn't want to I didn't want to put that training off because I really needed the help. So
Understood. Thank you so much for being with us, particularly given the competing needs. Ellen, go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Ellen Griswold. I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust. Actually, in a former life, I was a lawyer, a sort of energy regulatory lawyer, representing mostly renewable energy clients before FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So I didn't deal with citing at all, which tends to be a state issue, but I do have some familiarity with the renewable energy industry as a result of that. But then I really followed my passion for agriculture and made my way to Maine Farmland Trust. And we, as an organization, really became involved in this issue a couple years ago when the sort of different solar bills passed the legislature and were signed into law. And we started being contacted just by a lot of farmers who were being contacted by developers. And so we sort of quickly got up to speed on the issue, thanks to actually many folks, even who are part of this group, which is great. And we wound up sort of creating our own sort of guidance documents related to sort of best practices for citing projects on agricultural lands, as well as just some considerations and issues that farmers can be thinking about when they are talking with developers about different lease options or lease agreements, that sort of thing. We participated in another solar siting working group that was really convened by Eliza Donahue from Maine Audubon. And it was composed of sort of ag groups and environmental groups, as well as a bunch of solar developers. And we kind of worked together on some comments that we submitted to the PUC, really sort of advocating for incentives to guide development. And so that was sort of, we also created sort of a municipal guide to try and provide a little bit of guidance for municipalities in Maine, many of which were sort of confronted with sort of permitting solar projects for the first time. And I would say, so beyond those sort of more general areas, we also have now some practice of evaluating solar projects on land that we have conserved through the placement of an agricultural easement. And I would just say that we're really excited to be a part of this group and to learn from you all. We, just to echo what others have said, we absolutely think this isn't a black or white issue, and that with the right sort of policy mechanisms and incentives, we can really have both a robust solar energy industry in Maine, as well as a well-supported agricultural sector too. So just excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen. Sarah, go right ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sarah Hagerty. I'm a conservation biologist and GIS manager with Maine Audubon. And my perspective is probably a little bit different. I'm a wildlife biologist. And so I've actually spent several years looking at the intersection of renewable energy and wildlife and habitats. And just sort of head down wildlife biologist stuff. And in the last couple of years, as solar's really been gaining steam here in Maine, I've been working more closely with Eliza Donahue, our director of policy, to look at the intersections beyond just wildlife, because we want to see solar sited in Maine, and we want to see it sited appropriately. We want to see it have the support of the public. And so, as Ellen mentioned, Eliza had coordinated a group, and some of you were involved in that group, and I sat in on some of the meetings to hear the ag perspective. And so it very quickly became clear that the pressures are not just on wildlife and habitats, but on agricultural resources. And I'll go a little deeper into it a little later when I speak this morning. But so I've now been full on into the intersection between ag and renewable resources. And I want to thank those of you who have helped me come to the understanding of some of the challenges with ag and with the renewable industry and how to bring those together. And I apologize in advance if I say anything that's wrong. I'm still a wildlife biologist at heart, and I mean no harm. So please feel free to correct me on that. But this is a really exciting place to be right now, seeing solar happening on the landscape and seeing such a diverse group of folks together, talking about where it should go and how we all get the best renewable energy on the landscape with the least harm.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Caitlin, go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Jody, and thanks Nancy and Selena for bringing us all together. My name is Caitlin Hollinger. I'm a policy associate at Blue Wave Solar. We're really excited to be here. We're actually a community solar developer and service provider based in Boston, Massachusetts. And we have development all over the Northeast and very actively working in Maine right now. Our area of expertise is in dual use solar, where we have either grazing or actual row crops growing underneath the panels. And we work with farmers or grazers to create specific farm plans for each project and make sure we're complying with, the state regulations as well as the needs of each individual farmer to make sure that we can support their operations and protect the soils. So just one quick example for reference, I'll probably be referring to this a lot, and you may have seen it circulating around, but our Rockport project up in Maine is in partnership with the University of Maine. It's a blueberry farm, and we're doing a lot of data collection and soil testing for that project to kind of get some data about how dual use can work in Maine. And we're really excited. It's under construction right now. So yeah, thanks for having us.
Great, thank you. So glad to have you. Matt, go right ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for including me in the conversation and including Long Road. I'm the Chief Development Officer for Long Road. We are a kind of develop to own and operate developer with offices in Portland, Maine. We're backed by the New Zealand Pension Fund, which is, speaking of sheep, Nick, comes from a country with more sheep than people officially. So our mandate at Long Road is to develop a wide variety of small scale to utility scale wind and solar projects across U.S. markets, and really learning a lot about agriculture along the way. We deal with farmers all the time because they are often our landowners across U.S. markets, and they might have land in timber, they might have land that's in feed crop or whatever. So often thinking a lot about their economics and trying to figure out ways to work together so that they can keep farming and also benefit from the stable revenue from a solar or wind project that can really hedge against the ups and downs of crop prices. So we think there's a lot of opportunity here. I also want to acknowledge the issues. I think it's really can get very complicated from a siting perspective. I really appreciate Nick's perspective, like kind of pulling up on a project for the first time, looking out in a big field. For those of us who live in Maine, I mean, this place is beautiful. So want to make sure that we're protecting open space. I share those convictions as well. So a little battle of head and heart for me is sometimes, but learning and want to contribute to this conversation. We're breaking ground on a project that's located in Monmouth in June, and Andy Smith has been a part of that conversation at the Milk House, and really appreciate his contributions as well. It's made it a better project. We were looking at dual use on that project for grazing, and unfortunately there's DEP has some limitations there about allowing that because of phosphorus contributions from grazing animals. So that's a good example of something like I think we should dig into and figure out how do we get balance those two good things, which I think is part of the objective.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thanks for being with us. Fortunat, go right ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Fortunat Mueller. I'm co-founder and president of Revision Energy. Revision's a Maine-based, employee-owned clean energy company. We started in Liberty, Maine and Waldo County, and now have offices throughout New England. Our experience with solar and ag is maybe a little different than the other developers on the call, in part because we build solar at all different scales, all the way down to small residential projects. And we've done over the last 16 years, or 18 years, a lot of projects, small projects with farmers throughout northern New England, whether dairy farmers or CSAs or other farmers, often supported by USDA in one form or another. And so we've had a lot of opportunity to work with farmers on small projects for their own purposes, And now increasingly, as we're building larger projects, we're working with some of those same farmers and others on the siting questions that we're talking about here today. Totally agree with everybody's comments about sort of the need for policy. I'm really grateful for this group. I would encourage us to set our ambitions higher than just mitigating the downside of solar development on ag in Maine, because I think distributed solar in particular has really incredible opportunities for our rural economies. And I think there's an opportunity for us to think about how solar development can be an affirmative good for those economies and for the farmers who work in those places. And so I'd like to encourage us to be just a little bit more ambitious. And finally, I think last week was the first time we've had, sheep grazing and mowing around small arrays on farms for a long time. But last week, for the first time, we had a flock of sheep working one of our larger farms out in Skowhegan. So we're delighted to be experimenting with that and learning about that as well.
Great. Thank you, Fortunate. George.
Good morning. My name is George O'Keefe. I'm the Economic Development Director for the town of Brumford. Our intersection with solar and agriculture is very multifaceted. We have roughly 1,000 acres of prime producing farmland out in Brumford Point. And then we have very, very extensive quantities of forest, some of which are strategically positioned near transmission and distribution lines. So our agricultural intersect is both in the farming side and also in the forestry side. We also have we consider energy production to be one of our largest industries. In fact, it's probably more significant than the Brumford mill in terms of dollar amounts produced. And our energy portfolio here in Brumford is one of the most diversified in Maine. We have 400 megawatts of production in Brumford that's diversified across multiple sources, including some carbon sources and also some renewables. And I'm tying in the Roxbury Wind project as part of that. We also have a community solar farm that's been put into place. Very pleased with that project. So we have some pretty significant challenges with relation to understanding how solar development is going to occur, and also how we manage land use related to that. We have a solar ordinance, which I personally worked on here, which I think is probably one of the more developer-friendly solar ordinances in the state. And I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's also worth noting that we do not have zoning in Brumford. So our planning and development context is very different than most other communities.
Got it. Okay, super helpful to know all of this. I was just checking on the attendee side if we had Jeremy stuck over there. I think we still don't have him. If I'm wrong, just jump in, Jeremy, but I think otherwise we'll move on to Andy. Go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Andy Smith. My partner and I own the Milk House in Monmouth. We farm about 300 acres of owned and leased land. The focus is organic dairy, but we do a few other things, including we recently started growing a flock of Katahdin sheep to hopefully provide solar grazing services. As Matt alluded to, at the moment, we've hit a hiccup on that with what we hope will be our first site, but hopefully we'll be able to move past that. My experiences with solar, as a landowner, we live a mile from a substation. So it's just been a really interesting few years from after the legislation was passed that changed solar in the state. We were contacted by about 15 different companies wanting to lease a portion of our farm for development. And so that was very different from anything we had ever experienced. Suddenly we were in a very hot real estate market. But yeah, I guess, I am cautiously optimistic that, with a lot of guidance from the state government, that solar will be beneficial to the farming community. I know, that project in Monmouth is a perfect example of, developing a portion of a farm to help improve the economic viability of a dairy operation, while still, keeping the rest of it in agriculture. And also potentially providing a younger farmer an opportunity to access land. At the same time, I do know of other farmers in the state that have told me, who rely heavily on leased land for their operations, and they're under threat of development and losing access to the land that they've leased for quite some time. So it's just a really big balancing act and at the intersection of a lot of different issues between climate and access to land and just land transition, farmland transition in the state of Maine. So I'm excited to take part in this group.
Thank you, Andy. And just to clarify, both for you and Matt, just for everyone else's benefit, the farm that both of you referred to in Monmouth, is that your own, Andy, or is that it's a different farm that Matt, that you were referring to initially? I just wanted to clarify that.
That farm is owned by the Smith family, who are actually relatives of Julianne Smith, who I am not related to, just for clarification. No, it is not part of our land base.
Got it. Okay, that's what I thought, but just perfect. Thank you. Julianne.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Julianne Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Farm Bureau Association. As Andy mentioned, I actually grew up on a dairy farm in Monmouth. My family continues to farm it as a fourth generation farm. And my involvement in solar has primarily been trying to answer questions for farmers as they contact our organization and say, well, we've been contacted by this solar company, and what does this mean, and what should I look for, and what should I be careful about? So I've done a lot of research on that end of it, and have been involved primarily as a support and resource for farmers who are looking at the potential of having solar on their farm, and also the implications for when land that they lease may be turned into a solar project.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I'm glad you're with us. Patrick, go right ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be part of this panel. So my name is Patrick Wynn. I am a city councilor in Hollowell. And the city of Hollowell in 2019 resolved to make ourselves entirely renewable by 2040. And I'm happy to say that I think that we can probably meet that a good decade or better ahead of schedule. We're a small municipality with small energy demand, so we're hoping that one project will get the job done for us. And to meet that end, I'm also chairing the Solar Power Task Force here in Hollowell. So where it intersects with agriculture for me is I represent the rural farm district in Hollowell, which for those of you who might get through Augusta once in a while, that's the west side of I-95 in Hollowell, the part of the city where people don't really know it exists. And so the evolution here is gone from traditional farming, livestock and row crops, to hay fields, and now we're farming cul-de-sacs, which is another kind of pressure that is somewhat discouraging. So that's what we're trying to figure out. We've written the solar ordinance here, and we're trying to attract some solar development. And one issue that I'm particularly interested in this group trying to figure out, because I don't have the answer for it, is how do we make sure that any potential revenue source, I'm thinking equipment taxing, for the dual purpose arrays can be equal to the larger panel or just the larger equipment scale of traditional solar array.
Perfect. Thank you. Yvette, go right ahead. If you're on the line, which might not be. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
Hi, Yvette Minier. I'm a promotional coordinator with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. Prior to this work, I worked for a solar company in Maine. And I also, in my private life, have written the solar ordinance for the town of Topsom. And I also wrote the purchase power agreement, RFP, for our town, as well as the Brunswick Topsom Water District. I'm a trustee there, and they went solar. And I also worked with Brunswick Sewer District. So have a personal championing of this energy source. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Yvette. Ethan.
Thanks, Jody. Hi, everyone. Ethan Tremblay. Mentioned earlier, I'm the solar and storage analyst for the Governor's Energy Office. Happy to be facilitating the Zoom session for you all today and providing support to this group as it does its work. And I suppose I would say my background at the intersection of solar and agriculture is I've been in the renewable energy industry for some time now. Prior to that, at the University of Maine, actually did some graduate work focusing on agriculture and land use. Grew up on farms here in Maine, and so very interested in what everyone has to say and where this goes.
Great. I would just say quickly for myself, my exposure is more academic than practical on this issue. My undergraduate degree is in agriculture. My graduate degree is in environmental law and policy, and had some opportunity briefly to be a participant in a community solar project in Brunswick, which then got overcommitted, and so I'm not a part of that. So that's my limited personal experience to it, but in terms of facilitating processes, long experience with the Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry and other departments. So I think it was worth spending the time doing that. Don't worry about where we're tracking in terms of time on the agenda. We'll catch up. And I think what I'll do now is turn it over to both Selena and Ethan to talk about the current scope of solar development and drivers in Maine.
Thanks, Jody.
Yeah.
So I think Ethan is going to pull up some slides, but I want to take some time to make sure that we all have a shared understanding of the solar and energy policy in the state of Maine. The kind of important piece is solar is one piece of a larger strategy here. So we'll talk about renewable energy writ large and energy, but next slide, Ethan. And next slide. As many of you know, in 2019, the legislature with bipartisan support and the governor put in place a number of really important laws that have been driving our work. Obviously, the Maine Climate Council and the report that was put forward with several of you who were involved in that, which was, I think, really helpful in terms of setting some specific recommendations, both on the working land side, but also on the renewable energy and how to increase renewable energy sources, including solar in the state. And obviously meeting our ambitious greenhouse gas requirements. Next slide. And so at the same time, the governor also signed into law a number of clean energy specific legislation. One of them is a renewable portfolio standard, which is a certain percentage of energy needs to be from clean energy sources. And this is a chart just to show you where Maine ranks in terms of other states. This is just for new energy sources. Our goal is actually 80% by 2030. This is just new, so it's not quite the right numbers for our overall program, but it just shows you that we are have an ambitious target here, but as do the rest of the region as well. Next slide. And so we are part of a regional grid, ISO New England, and Maine makes up about 10% of the overall regional grid. And this is from 2000 to 2020 to give you a sense of the trends of the overall regional electricity market. And you can see probably the pieces to take away here are the trends in terms of fossil fuels. You have oil and coal dropping down, natural gas increasing, and you can't see much renewable energy, but a little bit there, 9% there. So it just gives you a sense of what has been the historic experience regionally. Next slide. So as I mentioned, Maine makes up about 10% of that regional market. Maine electricity generation is fairly clean. You can see that on the right-hand side. So in that sense, we're doing a good job getting closer to our requirement of 80% by 2030. But if you go to the next slide, one thing to keep in mind is while our clean energy sources for electricity are looking good, electric power actually makes up a fairly small percentage of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so with transitioning to beneficial electrification, which includes electrifying our transportation, looking at home heating. Maine has the highest oil home heating use in the nation. So how do we electrify those, and meeting new clean renewable energy sources to power those needs is where we're going to see growth in the renewable energy market. Next slide. And so Maine, the Governor's Energy Office did a study about how best to meet our renewable energy portfolio standards over the next 10 years. And we used analysis from the Climate Council to take a look at what is the new increased energy load that we need over the next coming years. And as you can see here, that blue triangle is all of the new investments in renewable energy that's needed between now and 2050. We're on track for the next several years to meet our renewable energy needs, but you see here that the demand is only going to grow significantly. So the planning that we're doing now will help us ensure that we have the right policies in place to help us meet those goals as we go forward. Next slide. And Fortunato brought up a really good point. Part of the Governor's Energy Office's role is not only to look at advancing clean energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions for climate purposes, but also to focus on building a clean energy economy. We see incredible opportunity for throughout the state and different communities to bring long-term jobs to the state. And so we've put forward a goal of 30,000 clean energy jobs by 2030, and solar is an important piece of that. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I just want to go through a few of the policies that are in place now that were signed into law in 2019. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail, but so you don't have to actually read all those words there, but that's just an overview of them. Next slide. So when we set the requirement of 80% by 2030 and a goal of 100% clean energy by 2050, it included procurement. So the Public Utilities Commission is going to do for 14% of electric load. And so we went through the first tranche of that procurement in 2020, and the second tranche is in process now with results expected this summer. And solar was as you can see there are 17 projects that were given term sheets, and that included 14 solar projects. So there is, it shows you that the prices for solar are competitive, and that there are, it's an area that it was able to compete with the procurement. And this one did not include site-specific, citing description in terms of the procurement decision that the PUC had to make. It had to include some economic development pieces that was weighed by the PUC, but didn't include specific stipulations around citing. Next slide. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, except to note that I think a lot of work was done to put into law in 2019 a distributed generation procurement program, block program for 375 megawatts that did include citing considerations. The legislature is currently reviewing this program. The first round, the PUC decided was not successful, and so didn't award any bids then. But I think shows that there are some good pieces to that, and we can see how we may use them in the future. But that is not going to. We'll see what the legislature does in the next couple of weeks, but I anticipate that we'll see some changes to this program. Next slide. And so the current net energy billing program is for projects that are 5 megawatts or below. There are a number of different ways that you can use everything from residential rooftop solar to larger projects up to 5 megawatts, and different ways of either getting energy credits or dollar credits that different companies are using. And then you also see community solar here, where people who can participate in a program as well. And so this program is under review by the legislature, and we do anticipate that there will be changes to it. Next slide. And so looking ahead, we have whatever comes out of the legislature on the net energy billing program. the renewable portfolio procurement tranche 2, which is only for 4.5% or so of our electric load. The PUC has authority to do periodic procurements. And then I think the fourth piece is anything else that the legislature determines is needed to purchase or require purchase of new energy sources there. So that's looking ahead. Next slide. And so I think the last thing I'll just say before turning it over to Ethan to take a look at what's happening now in terms of projects is we're not spending a lot of time here talking about cost, but that is a big conversation and discussion here. And so in terms of the renewable energy policy about how we best meet our growing energy needs in a cost-effective manner. And I think that when we're thinking about how to put in place incentives or programs related to the agricultural and solar mix, we also have to be mindful of how much those costs, what's the equitable way to balance those costs, and how does it compare to other energy sources, knowing that at the end of the day, Maine ratepayers do need to pay for these projects, and we want to do so in a responsible manner. So that is something that always is something we think about when advancing these programs, is how do we balance that cost to ratepayers. So I'll pass it to you, Ethan, to talk a little bit about what's happening now in terms of solar projects.
Thank you, Selena. So this slide that you're looking at right now, this is a chart that the Energy Office does maintain, showing what's currently operating in Maine for solar. So these are the panels that are actually no longer in construction, not in development, but actually generating energy and delivering it to customers. So the orange bars that you're seeing, that's the growth in megawatts that's happened each year, all the way up through 13 megawatts so far this year in 2021. The yellow wedge that you're seeing, that's the cumulative total of all of that development. So as you can see in that little box in the upper right corner, we're at about 174 megawatts as of April. There is a little bit of a lag to some of this data. So we understand that there are quite a few panels going in the ground, and some that are generating have come on in recent weeks, and this will be updated. The drivers of this growth that you're seeing are numerous. Some of them are the policy changes that Selena's just walked us through. Some of it is also just the market. The solar cost of photovoltaic panels has come down precipitously over the past few years, and solar is generally becoming competitive with other more sort of traditional generation sources. So that is natural growth that we're seeing in the market there. This slide, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. What we're trying to do here is just give you a sense of what's potentially coming or in development in Maine. There are different ways to look at this. So what we're summarizing here are called the interconnection queues. That bar on the left is the ISO queue. So as Selena mentioned, Maine is part of a regional electricity market with the rest of New England. We are on the same grid. And so those tend to be larger projects connecting at the transmission level. The right two bars, you'll see one for Central Maine Power, one for Versant Power. Those are what are called the level 4 interconnection queues. Those are the distribution level. So the smaller power grid that actually delivers the energy to Maine homes and businesses. These are megawatts that are in the queues. So you can see about almost 2,700 at the transmission level, and then a combined 2,400 or so at the distribution level in Maine. Interconnection queues, it's good to think of them as sort of a leading indicator of capacity. So this is not all projects that will get built. As an example, the ISO estimates about 70% of the megawatts that enter their queue are never constructed. The function of the queue is essentially that early in the development process, projects may have secured a potential site and will go to the utility, the relevant interconnecting authority, and conduct some engineering studies to determine whether they can interconnect to the grid, and if so, if there are any upgrade costs that the project would bear to do so. This is an important part of the development process for renewable energy, and it is a point at which many projects may learn that they're not viable and don't move forward. So again, this is kind of a leading indicator. There is attrition that happens to these numbers. As well as interconnection projects also, and we can certainly talk about this more. I'm sure folks can share their experience, but other reasons that projects that we may see in the interconnection queues don't eventually move forward include financing risk, policy and market changes, permitting issues, land, other things like that, local dialogue. So these are, again, sort of an early indication, but what we're seeing here from the interconnection queues is essentially a sign that Maine, as everyone seems to have recognized in your comments earlier, does have a burgeoning solar market. So that's what we have for sort of an introductory overview of Maine's solar market, and I'm happy to take a swing at any questions that anyone might have at this point or comments.
Yeah, let's do that. Why don't you, let's stop sharing screen and then so we can see participants again, and questions that people may have, that stakeholder group members have about the data that was provided at this point. And you can just raise your hand if you do. Yeah, go right ahead, Matt.
Just a quick one, maybe not as much about the data, but sort of go on a go forward basis. And maybe this is for some combination of Selena and Ethan, but are you, I think there was some discussion about maybe a procurement in the future, maybe for distributed generation projects that would have some siting criteria. I think you mentioned that was a possibility, maybe not in this call, but maybe in others. It's an interesting, for me, I'm just wondering if that's a tool that this group could kind of look to as a management tool going forward. I know there hasn't been a siting component previously in these procurements, but if you're managing for certain objectives like benefit farmers, benefit low-income Mainers, want to manage for certain objectives. I'm wondering if that's a policy tool that's available.
I think as we've seen in other, as I'm sure you've seen in other states, it can be having those considerations in procurements is a great way to drive development in the areas where we want to see it. So I think from a policy standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. I do think that we have to be mindful about the costs that we're adding to these programs from an overall perspective. While the legislature will do what it will do, I think one thing that will happen as a result of what the conversations right now are about, potentially making changes to the existing net energy billing program, and then setting aside some time to figure out how net energy billing should work going forward. And when I said net energy billing, I really mean actually DG, distributed generation, because there are different tools, whether it be net energy billing or procurement, where it could be appropriate to add in adders associated with certain siting considerations. And so my hope is that the process going forward will provide enough flexibility to have dialogue, and that the pieces that we discuss now in this group, and I'm glad we're starting now, can hopefully feed into any future stakeholder conversation on the distributed generation future program development.
Great.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ellen.
I was just wondering if you'll, during sort of the course of our work here, you'll be sharing information about the 14 solar projects that are moving forward as a result of the first tranche of the RPS procurement.
Ethan, what do we know about those? You've been following that more closely.
We could certainly provide a little bit more information now that that tranche is public and those projects have contracts. We could follow up with some more info about the communities that they're located in and the project size, if that's helpful. Is that kind of what you're imagining, Ellen?
Yeah, absolutely. Where they're located especially would be great.
So where, and we could have an offline conversation, but I think probably some further details than the where would be really useful to this group as well. Maybe soils, whatever. Okay, we'll make a point to do that and also share the slides that you just saw with this group as well. And I think the plan generally is that there is a web page on both the Governor's Energy Office's website now and the Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry, and we'll have meeting materials and presentation materials posted there shortly after each meeting. Okay, any other questions before we move on to the solar siting mapping tool? Go right ahead, Fortunat.
I don't know if it's useful to sort of work towards a common definition of what we mean when we talk about various size solar projects. One of the things I noticed in reviewing some of the stuff on the Department of Ag's website today is that I think you use anything bigger than an acre utility scale solar, and I think that's pretty inconsistent with the way the industry would likely talk about those projects. And so just in the interest of clarity, it might be useful to think about, just make sure we're using the same language for different scales over time. It doesn't have to be right now, but somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm.
The projects that Ethan describes, as he said, are in sort of two buckets: transmission connected projects, which tend to be larger. They tend to be larger than 20 acres in size, larger than 5 megawatts nameplate rating, and the distribution connected projects, which are almost all 5 megawatts and lower.
Mm-hmm. And so are those two categories that people generally think about, and that's the distinction, is at the 5 megawatt level, and there isn't this 1 acre thing. There's just the, are you above or are you below 20 acres?
In sort of the solar ordinances and municipal ordinances that I have been involved with, there's a couple of categories, and sort of accessory use to some existing building, very small, and that's probably not the purview of this group, I would imagine. Then maybe what they call medium scale, which might be up to 5 acres or so, and then large scale, which is 5 acres to 20 acres, and then utility scale, which is 20 acres and up. And those are rough areas and sizes, but that's kind of how the divisions I've seen have been. So.
Thank you. George, go right ahead.
Yeah, I strongly support that that Fortunat's comments about the distinctions. 1 acre and above being considered utility scale struck me as well as being a very unusual categorization. So in terms of trying to define things and understand how the industry works, and I also think in terms of understanding how to how to consider and manage impacts, I completely agree that the definitions that he mentioned are much more in line with basically everything else that we're going to see, and that includes development projects that are underway in Maine right now.
Okay, great, duly noted. We can talk about that, and Nancy and Selena and I and Yvette and Ethan can follow up on that. Anything else before we move on? Okay, thank you all. Great questions. So Sarah, go right ahead. And she'll be speaking about tools that Maine Audubon has developed.
Thank you. And let me just get my slideshow going. Can everyone see just a slide? Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So I want to thank everyone for inviting Maine Audubon to be involved in this discussion. As I mentioned before, this is a little bit sideways to what we would normally be thinking about. And I thought that maybe I would start by walking us through how Maine Audubon got to this point, speaking at the Agricultural Stakeholder Group about solar siting. And along the way, I'll talk about the tools that we've developed as we've gone, including a brand new tool that we hope to release in the next week or so as we get our final approvals on that tool. So as you probably know, Maine Audubon's mission is to conserve Maine's wildlife and wildlife habitats through public engagement. And climate change is currently the most significant threat to Maine's wildlife and habitats, with 2/3 of all North American birds at risk from climate change. It's also estimated that about 1/3 of all the plant and animal species and their habitats here in Maine are already being affected by climate change. And these are some of the most iconic species: our loons, our moose, our eastern brook trout, and the habitats that people think about when they think about Maine. And so we understand that the best way to address climate change, and therefore address the concerns that we have for our wildlife and their habitats, is to shift over to a clean energy economy. And that's why Maine Audubon has been very strongly in support of this shift to renewable energy in all fronts, as long as it's done appropriately. And that's where this discussion takes us. So we started this a few years ago, actually, and that's why I was saying my intersection started with looking at the intersection of, or my involvement in this started with looking at the intersection of renewable energy and wildlife and habitats. And in 2019, we published a review paper, basically looking at the scientific literature to look at what the intersections are between renewable energy and wildlife and habitats within the literature, and how can we use that knowledge to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the impacts as we see renewable energy coming into Maine. This report really focused on solar, terrestrial wind, offshore wind, and transmission, because those are the big places that we expect to see the most conflict, basically. And as Ellen mentioned, that paper came out just as we got the legislation, the solar legislation passed in 2019. And Eliza Donahue was involved from our office in getting that solar coalition together to get the legislation going. But once it got passed, a lot of the folks kept working together to make sure that we were continuing to work to get renewable energy on the ground and in the right places. And this group is a mix of environmental NGOs, agricultural NGOs, solar developers, some input from natural resource agencies and other interested parties. And one of the things that came up a lot was that siting is an issue. Where should renewable energy be, and what are the conflicts we need to worry about? And some of the developers said, well, where's the map that shows us the places to avoid or the places to go? In other states, they have some of those resources already. And so we said, okay, we need that. Why don't we build that? And so that's where my education into how solar energy development and siting happens. And we created this solar siting map last year. I'm a wildlife biologist, so I always think that developers start by saying, where are the most important resources that I need to protect and avoid? But obviously that's not the case. And particularly for solar development, your first question is, how am I going to get to the grid, right? So the focus is on the existing electrical infrastructure. And so that was a shift in our way of thinking. And so that was the main focus of the map. So when it comes up with the transmission lines and the substations that already exist. And then thanks to that group again, and some of the folks in this meeting, we came to understand that solar really has fairly tight margins, particularly for these smaller projects that were just being discussed. You're not going to build a 40-mile transmission line to get to the grid. You're going to be pretty close to the grid. And so we were told sort of 1 to 5 miles, probably, depending on the size of that project. And so we decided to show where the resources were within that sort of 5-mile buffer. So again, we start with the infrastructure, the transmission, and the substations, and then we give you this whole list of other layers that you can turn on and turn off to see where things are in relation to a site that you're looking at. We put the buffers on so that users can focus on those areas. And this isn't just for developers, it's also for towns and landowners and other organizations that are interested in looking at solar. Maine Audubon wasn't the only one that had to learn a lot to really understand where solar is going to go. And I was in a lot of conversations where people said, oh, there's so many acres of Maine that we need to worry about. But you really don't, because solar is going to stay close to the infrastructure. So we put those buffers on, and then we add the resources only within those buffers, that we can keep the focus on the areas that are most likely to be developed for solar. And so we did add the landfills, the capped landfills, the gravel pits, brownfields, all of those sites that we would like to see developed where they can be. And then we started adding all the other resources. We added the aquatic buffers, which are sort of like shoreline zone buffers, high value plant and animal habitats. These are rare species habitats, significant habitats, natural communities, and other resources that we would like to see avoided if possible. And then we put in conservation land, and then we put in forest land, and then we put in farmland soils. And pretty soon it's a pretty full map. But our goal in the map was really to simply provide information, to have one-stop shopping, just one place to go to say, well, where are the prime soils in Maine, if we're concerned about that? Where are the rare species habitats? Where are the brook trout habitats? And where are the landfills? So we wanted to offer one-stop shopping, again, trimmed to just that 5-mile buffer, but it doesn't really offer guidance. It just says, here's the information. Here are links to the appropriate regulatory agencies. please have a conversation with them. So we put that out last year as solar projects were being developed on the landscape. And again, that coalition was continuing to talk about what additional tools, what additional information do folks need, do towns need, do developers need, do private landowners need as we start seeing solar being developed. And so with some of the other agricultural and conservation NGOs, I think Ellen mentioned this, we pulled together a best practices document. It's just a short 4-pager where we talk about what are the best practices for siting solar in natural areas, in agricultural areas, and then sort of general good BMPs for solar development. And the best practices are what you would think, they're pretty common sense. Prioritize disturbed and developed lands first. Avoid the high value wildlife habitats, avoid the high value agricultural soils. They're common sense if you're coming from the perspective that I was just talking about. I'm a wildlife biologist. I said, well, of course, the first thing you're going to do is try and avoid those habitats. But often in identifying sites, because of the constraints with the infrastructure, you're really focused on infrastructure and you find your site and then you start thinking about those other pieces. So we're trying to turn this on its head a little bit and ask folks to be looking at these things earlier in the process instead of after you've finalized a site. So we put that out, shared that with the community. A lot of the towns and developers are using those documents as well. And then, another year's gone by now, and we wanted to see, well, where has solar been happening on the landscape? And, or better yet, where is solar being proposed in Maine? And this is where the GIS piece of me comes out. And we actually got some information from DEP on projects that have been proposed to DEP. And we pulled them into GIS and we took a look at them. Where do they intersect with the natural resources and agricultural resources that we're concerned about? And so these little suns represent the 180 roughly projects that have come into DEP. These are not all projects that are going to happen. Some of them are just information requests. Some of them are projects that have been proposed, but as Ethan mentioned, there's going to be attrition. They're not all going to happen. And if it was a project that didn't need to go through DEP, it's not in this. But it gives us a good snapshot of where these projects are. And you can see that they're in all 16 counties, but really primarily focused in southern Maine and the Central Coast. And I should have put the transmission lines on here because they just follow the transmission lines of the state. They really are tied to the electrical infrastructure of the state. Some caveats with this analysis, this intersection analysis. Again, these are only projects that went through DEP. They're not all going to happen on the ground. And the mapping for those projects and for the natural resources, natural and agricultural resources are variable. So some of the projects that we got from DEP are actual limits of work. So that really gives you an idea of where that footprint's going to be and what sorts of resources it's intersecting with. Some of them are the entire parcel. Some of them are just a dot on a map for a site location. And so they come back to us as like a square. So the quality is variable for those project footprints. And then the natural resources and agricultural resources are mapped at different scales and from different, they're generated from different sources. So we have the land use land cover data, which is very, very rough and designed to be used at more of like a regional or even national scale. And then we have the NRCS soils layer that really gets right down to the ground where you are. So there's some variability there. But what we found was in doing, so this is to answer that question of what's my information on, or my experience with the intersection of solar projects and agricultural resources, it's literally a spatial intersection is what I've been looking at. And from the Maine Audubon perspective, we said, well, where are the habitats that we're most concerned about and how many of those are being intersected with these projects? And of those 180 projects, about 88 of them intersect with large forest blocks. And these are blocks that they're scaled by ecoregion. So that a forest block in southern Maine is very different from a forest block in northern Maine, and they're scaled appropriately. And a large forest block is one that's larger than the median size of the forest blocks in that ecoregion. if that makes sense. It's a process that, beginning with habitat, first developed several years ago, and we just updated that layer. So 88 of the 180 projects intersect these forest blocks, which are considered to be pretty important habitat areas. We then looked at the high value plant and animal habitats. Again, these are rare species habitats, significant habitats like vernal pools and IWWHs, and natural resource or natural communities, all sort of put together. And we found that 73 of those 180 projects intersect with those high value plant and animal habitats. So this was sort of concerning to us, and we can dive down and look at all the individual projects, and they're going through DEP review. And so where there's a regulatory nexus, these issues are being addressed. Then we broadened our look at all of the projects and where they're intersecting, and we looked at the agricultural resources. And that's where the light bulb went off, and we said, wow, agricultural lands are really seeing the highest pressure compared to the natural lands. The natural lands are seeing a lot of pressure, but so are the agricultural lands. And we found that 104 of those 180 proposed projects intersect what are considered to be large agricultural blocks. And these are areas that have 5 acres, contiguous 5 acres of cropland or 10 acres of pasture land. So they're the larger blocks on the landscape, and the vast majority of the proposed projects are intersecting with those areas. And then we also took a look at the soils, the prime agricultural soils and the soils of statewide significance. And we found that 163 of those 180 intersect with one, the other, or both of those types of soils. And so these are the most important, the most potentially highly productive soils in the state. And then when you actually look at where, I don't have the numbers on it, but when you look at where the large blocks and the soils come together, it's still the vast majority of what's going on here. So we're talking about potentially losing active agricultural lands that are cited on the most productive, our best agricultural soils. And so this is part of why this stakeholder group is here, right? This is what we want to talk about, and how do we protect those resources. So then the next thing that we looked at was, well, how many of these projects are happening on gravel pits and landfills? There's got to be some of that happening. And we were pretty disappointed to find that 11 of the 180 projects intersect with gravel pits, and just 6 of them are on capped landfills. Now remember, these aren't all the projects that are solar projects in the state of Maine. They're just the ones that in this 180 group that went to DEP, but proportionally and in relation to the other intersections, this was pretty disappointing to us. And so this made us think that there's great stuff here to discuss for this group and other stakeholder groups to guide siting, and some other tools that can be available to guide siting. But one of the other things that we thought about was, maybe that solar siting tool that we used, we didn't provide guidance, and maybe we really should have provided some guidance. And so that's where the hot off the presses, hopefully going to go public in the next week or so, tool came to be. I mean, it started as the solar siting map 2.0, and then we realized that terrestrial wind projects are coming back as well. Renewable energy is coming across the board, and so we broadened our scope to look at renewable energy, terrestrial renewable energy in this siting tool. We start again with the infrastructure, the electrical infrastructure, the transmission and substations. But then we take a different approach, and we use sort of a stoplight approach with red, yellow, and green to guide projects or site selection. Green areas are the previously developed areas. That's your landfills and your gravel pits, where we would like to see the development happening. The yellow areas are the ones where you need additional information. Maybe they're green, maybe they're red, but we really just don't know from the spatial tool. And then red areas are sites that we would prefer to see avoided, and those are those high value plant and animal habitats and the prime soils and things like that. Now, this is a spatial tool. This is a GIS analysis, and all of these layers are created separately. So there's overlap. You may have red and green overlapping. And so those are some of the places that we need to have conversations or some rules. And a lot of times it's really a stream cutting through an otherwise developed landscape. So they're pretty easy to address. If you click on a polygon, you get a pop-up with a description and comments that provide guidance. You know, this is a great place to develop or it's not. Who to contact for additional information, particularly if there's regulatory oversight, and then the source of the data. There are a number of there are dozens and dozens of data sets that you can use to guide your site selection, and we've binned them into like groups. And so we have energy resources, we have environmental layers, we have previously developed layers, we have agricultural layers, and then just sort of administrative boundaries. But you can also pull in your own data. And so if you have additional data that can inform the mapping or the site selection, you can pull that in from ArcGIS Online, from a web service, or from your own files. This can be useful if you're a developer and you have a site you're looking at and you want to see the intersection, or if you are looking at a broader scale and you have an additional larger data set that you want to look at to hone in on citing. This tool also has some screening tools so that you can gather information from a location fairly quickly. There are two different tools. One is a quick assessment tool, and it allows you to define the area of interest and by drawing it or pulling it in, and then it's preset to pull information from different sets of data sets, depending on what types they are. So you can click through them. You don't have to have the layers turned on for this tool to work. You'll still get the information back. And it highlights where those places are within the map as you click through the tabs, and it gives you information like where the different substations are, how many solar projects are in this view, how many wind projects, those sorts of things. And again, you notice they come on and off as you click on the tabs. They don't have to be turned on. You'll see them as they come up. One of the other things it does is it for some of these layers, it can quantify the total acres, but a reminder on that is that it's not the total, it doesn't do a clip. It's the total acres of all the polygons that it intersects. So this is a good example of all the forest polygons, forest blocks. It doesn't tell you how many acres are in that blob. It tells you how many acres are in all of those forest blocks. The other tool that is included is more of a reporting screening tool, and this lets you decide what things you want to have additional information on, and then you have to have those turned on. And if you don't turn them on, you won't get the additional information. So you can again draw your own polygon or bring in your shapefile, and then you can get a report, and it gives you a brief report inside the tool. You can open up the plus symbols here. If there is a red exclamation point, that means that you didn't have the layer on, and you're not going to have additional information. For the layers that you do have on, you can open them up and get the additional information, and then you can print from this tool and get a nice report that has a map that shows all the resources you had turned on, and then tables of all of the information from each of those types of resources. Again, it only analyzes what has been turned on. So you decide with this one what you want to gather the information from. So that's a really quick overview of some of the tools that we have available. And again, this last one that I just showed you, I'm thinking is probably going to be the most helpful. It's not publicly available, but I'm perfectly happy to share the link if folks are interested in poking around in it. We're trying to get sort of last feedback on it. Some things to remember about this is not a regulatory tool, and I want to be really, really clear about that, because some of the layers that are used in here, people get confused about whether they're regulatory or not. The data come from a variety of sources. They're being updated all the time. Another thing is that we use data sets that are already commonly in use. So we're using the NWI wetlands. We're beginning with habitat layers, so that we're all speaking with the same voice and using the same data sets when we're talking about where these intersections are really happening. And then some of the data layers come on and off as you zoom in and out, so that you don't crash the system by having all of the wetlands in Maine turned on. So it helps maintain stability, and it also helps usability and viewability. that was the whirlwind tour that I had for some of the tools that we have for solar siting. And I hope that they're helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I used screenshots because it's a little rainy here and that always messes up connections. So I apologize for the static images.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. And as we come back to seeing one another, questions about these resources that you have for Sarah right now? Go right ahead, Caitlin, and then Nick.
Thanks, and thanks, Sarah, for the overview. Just wondering, you mentioned at the beginning of talking about this new site tool that it's not public yet, but you're planning to roll it out soon. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to kind of like the publication and communications plan, like who are you sending it out to? Will you be doing trainings, or kind of what's the framing around how to use this and who gets to use it?
Yeah, that's a super great question. And that's one of the reasons that it's sort of taken a little bit longer than we would like, because we really wanted to get this out as early as possible. One of the delays was that we decided to add wind, because that's happening too. But the other is, how do you, there's a lot in here. And so sort of putting it out there and saying, good luck, it doesn't work well. So we have a user guide that we're working on, and we're also building a story map to walk you through it. And so we have sort of our channels, and I apologize, Eliza Donahue is like the master of how to best communicate these tools. She's home with her brand new baby, and so I'm all you have, I'm afraid. But we have, with our communications team, we are planning on getting it out to as many of the user groups as possible, to developers, to the towns, any of the folks associated with this type of stakeholder group, the natural resource agencies. They provided a lot of the data and a lot of the input on some of the language to use. And I have been talking to our communications staff about the fact that we probably need some walkthroughs, whether we would set them up sort of standalone independently or in conjunction with various conferences. So I've spoken to the MMA conference, and I'm actually speaking at SEIA this afternoon, just more broadly on siting, but some of these places where folks are already talking about these things, but super happy to hear any suggestions on ways to get to target audiences.
Great, thank you. Nick, go right ahead.
Thank you. And Sarah, thanks for your presentation. I actually played with this a little bit, did a call today, a little bit over the weekend. And it's a great upgrade to web soil survey tool, or, the old school hardbound copy of, 1940s aerials of soil types here in Maine. You had mentioned that the 104 of the 180 proposed projects, again, that may not all go through, but intersect with large ag blocks, and then 163 with high value ag soils. But I believe you also said you haven't identified yet what percentage of those points of intersection, what percentage are the actual, for instance, soils of statewide significance or high value, most productive agricultural soils.
Yeah.
Is that detail something that's going to come with this new hot off the press element?
Yeah, and I've run those calculations in the past. I hesitated to do that again for today because of the vagaries of the boundaries of the projects. But it's on the order of sort of 70 to 80% of the acreage is intersecting with those soils. And remember that that includes both prime and soils of statewide significance, and there's much less of the prime soils, and so there's a much smaller percentage, but it is always the vast majority of the acreage that is within those soil types.
So we are tracking a little bit behind, and I'm going to suggest that we take a break right now, that we come back at 10:50, so 6 minutes from now, and we pick back up on the agenda on the second page. See you, very shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, for coming back on time. You get the gold star. Andy, you get the second gold star. Oh, they're all blacking. All right, here we are. I'm going to kick us off just in the spirit of modeling our good time, our being on time. So if you shift to page 2 of the agenda, and let me just say, do we have Sarah? Yes, we do. Thank you so much for that presentation. I neglected to thank you before we jumped off, and great information to know that it's coming our way soon. So there are sort of 2 agenda items that I think are overlapping, and as Nancy and Selena and Yvette and Ethan and I were talking about how to frame this up today. I would ignore the time allocations between these two. If you turn to page 6 of your packet, this was the group's attempt to sort of succinctly say what the overarching issues are associated with this issue. And I think what we'd like to get from all of you is, does this adequately capture what the problem is that we're trying to address? Does this capture the major factors at play at a high level? And so just in terms of being on the same page about the problem that you're trying to solve, does this feel like an accurate capturing of it? So if you want to just take one moment to look at page 6 and the other 2 pages that I might suggest you look at, or at least I'll read a couple of excerpts from, is on page 27. Part of the recommendations from the Natural and Working Lands Work Group were to the Maine Climate Council that made it into the Climate Action Plan are that the state should develop policies by next year, 2022, to ensure that renewable energy project siting is streamlined and transparent while seeking to minimize impacts on natural and working lands and engaging key stakeholders. So that's sort of the concrete impetus behind the creation of this group, and that protecting natural and working lands is critical to maximizing carbon storage and to support working farms. And then on page 33 of your packet, and this was excerpts from the DACF's technical guidance on utility scale solar installation. I just want to read a couple of excerpts from that. As we work to achieve greater renewable energy generation, it's equally important to ensure that solar development does not negatively impact our state's agricultural and natural resources, including active farmland. As a general statement of policy, DACF strongly recommends siting of commercial scale solar projects on non-agricultural lands, and that these natural areas, productive soils, and prime agricultural lands are finite resources that can take decades to restore, and in some cases, restoration may not even be possible. So that's the conundrum that you're all sitting with. And I think I'm just looking for the group's feedback, all of you, as to whether you think this page 6 kind of accurately captures what you're trying to address. So any thoughts at all about that? Go right ahead, George.
So I think based on our experience, it's worth noting that most of our development on solar appears to be targeting forest land. And some of this is forest land that has been cut over 2, 3, 4, 5 times in the past 100 years. And I think there's sort of an incongruity in sort of understanding the implications for farmland and for food production versus the implications for forest land, which I think are very different at this point. I know lumber prices are really high right now, but in general, forest land, I think, has like a different set of environmental considerations, and it also has a different set of considerations related to impacts, and how those are managed. And so that's kind of my concern as I look through this, knowing the way our economy works up here and knowing the solar projects that are coming in. We've got, forest land is kind of getting tied in on this issue, and it's a really significant issue, but I feel like it almost should be 2 tracks in some ways in how we address this from a policy standpoint. You have one track that says, when we're talking about food productive farmland, here's one set of considerations, and those farmlands typically have some water quality implications that forest land may not. And then there's the forest side, which is habitat considerations, wildlife considerations. possibly some water quality or even aquifer considerations. But I think, and then there's also the carbon implications of cutting trees to, try and go carbon free. But I'm worried about the approach from a statement of issues. And this is also sort of a broader question in terms of the other parts of the forest economy, which have lost a lot of mills and are not cutting trees like they used to. I mean, we have a lot of overgrowth in certain species, softwood species and so forth. So that would be that's kind of my first impression. I think the agricultural side is very, very clear. You have to protect food productive land, among other things.
Reactions to that from the rest of the group or any other element of what's on page 6? Yes, go right ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, so my reaction to page 6 is, yes, I think that is a good overview of what this group should work on. But when we jump ahead to the excerpts from DACF's technical guidance, a concern I have is that it doesn't address other pressures to this ag land. And I think of where I am, and I don't know what the industry term would be, but the suburban housing pressure. So solar could actually be an opportunity to preserve that land into the next generation. And if we don't site solar on some of this valuable ag land, then it will wind up being housing stock.
Thank you. Emily, go right ahead.
I appreciate what Patrick just said, and I think I'd like to maybe expand upon that thought a little more. We are very concerned with development, and low density residential development often then makes it more likely to have it be very, high density or urban development. I think it is important to think about the other pressures and think about solar potentially as an alternative. But I do want to just caution that we want to make sure we're thinking about solar siting on that land that doesn't effectively render it developed. That still make sure that it's active and available to stay farmland, to be actively farmed, to be returned to sort of broad farming opportunities at the end of the useful life. And so I just wanted to sort of put that note out there as well.
Thank you, Emily. Ellen, go ahead.
Well, this is maybe more about sort of the bottom of the page, and but just when we think about sort of shared principles, I think part of that will, or a part of it that will be important, is really sort of defining what we mean by dual use, and just how we're conceptualizing that concept, because I think sometimes I've been in conversations and realized that I'm operating from a certain definition, and the person I'm talking with has a very different definition of what I mean by that, or what the term means. And I know we received some DACF guidance materials about that, but just to make sure that we all support, how that's being defined and are kind of on the same page about that, I think will be important.
Got it. Nick, and then Sarah.
I appreciate some of the comments on whether the solar can be an effective placeholder on agricultural land. I think one of the challenges is that we're not yet seeing sites in a volume decommissioned. We don't know fully what decommissioning looks like, and maybe some of the folks here, Matt or Fortunate, can speak to that. In conversations I've had with folks, when you bring up the idea that, after their useful life, these sites may be, in fact, taken down, and there's great ways to do installations now with land screws and stone baskets, et cetera, that can have them be temporary in a 25, 30-year span. But most folks will come back and say, oh no, they'll just be upgraded and replaced with newer modules and newer modern equipment. So, those sites will just keep going. I think it would be important in our process to gather more information on that. And maybe there are members here that can bring some of that to the conversation, so that when there are conversations around useful lifespan and questions around, is solar a placeholder to preserve land from other residential or commercial development, we have that information on what a site looks like when it's effectively at its end of life. I also think in the future, doesn't need to come in right now, it will become increasingly important to look at those materials and what are those cradle to cradle plans for materials. Is there a reuse? Will there be a new waste stream that we're just scratching the surface on? I'll stop.
Thanks. Sarah, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to quickly reiterate George's point about, of course I have to say, we got to think about the natural landscape as well as the agricultural landscape. And I think having that at least always in the back of our mind when we're thinking about the pressures on agricultural land is helpful, so that we don't end up with a push and pull between the natural land and the agricultural land, so that we're thinking big picture, best siting for all of our natural and working lands.
Great. Yeah, makes sense. Other thoughts about this page before we move on to, I think, where really we need to devote most of our time is essentially page 7. And that is, I think I want to turn this to both Nancy and Selena briefly, because there are different ways in which in the early planning of this group process, they were thinking about, ultimately you have to identify what's going to be the best use of your time over the next 6 months. You could dive deeply into specific levers. You could be looking at this in kind of higher level buckets of opportunities to work on. And so does it make sense, maybe Nancy, for me to turn it over to you briefly, and then we can dive in a little bit more deeply about this?
Sure, absolutely. I think the real work for this group is going to be set by these deliberations in terms of how we want to focus our time and our efforts in a thoughtful manner. And what page 7 tried to do was sort of surface very high level potential levers and mechanisms that could be useful tools to guide public policy around ag solar siting in the future. Each one of them could take 6 months and a study in and of itself. But we know that that's not possible. So would it make sense to really focus in a couple of bucketed areas in which each bucket includes a couple of levers for further discussion and deliberation? So when we think about it, there's sort of a statutory regulatory bucket that the state of Maine, through its various, through the legislature and through its various agencies, would utilize certain levers to install requirements around ag solar siting and what those might be. Then there's sort of the more high level best management practices or guidance, voluntary, et cetera, which could include what has already started within Maine of guidance from various entities, pollinator habitat, best practices, et cetera. And is there thinking around that? And then there's the incentive bucket, which really, what's the finances around this? How do we incentivize dual use or other or siting in particular areas, et cetera? We wanted to break this out into categories and hopefully get your buy-in on that, just as a way to organize these topics, to set forward the agendas and the planning for future meetings. So we want to see if those 3 buckets make sense to you. And then also that list of the levers by no means is complete. There's probably things out there that you would want to add. And you might also say, we're not interested. We really don't want to talk about X right off the bat. So hopefully that explains our thinking in which we want this to be a coherent, organized way of moving forward. But right now we want to get your input on whether that makes sense and what would be in those buckets so that we can, as staff, get ready and organize, invite people to participate, provide information, what data you need, etc. Did I say that well, Jody?
Yeah, that's great, Nancy. Selena, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that I think an emphasis on just indication so that we can provide space and information that will help guide this conversation. And we know we may not be able to say which bucket we want to, perhaps if people feel like they need more dialogue before we even get into the bucket conversation, that is another point that would be good to raise too, because I understand that not every member, panelist has all the information that might be helpful to decide what tool will be most useful to solve the problem.
Great. So go ahead, Matt.
I thought all those are great comments. I just had one, I guess, question. How are we thinking about framing the issue in terms of, I guess, avoiding kind of perverse incentives, right? You want farmers to be able to kind of capture the opportunity, and not all farmland is created equal. I was just sort of looking at some of the percent limitations, and right, so it's starting to kind of like look like a winnowing down of the opportunity set for a farmer. And I'm wondering, yeah, like for example, we had one site that was all feed crop and kind of a gift to Monsanto more than an environmental benefit, or right, it was sort of like pre-treated with pre-emergent, right? Like this thing is loaded with stuff that is, I don't think, super helpful for the environment. We're putting solar on there. I think there's an environmental benefit that is potentially in the pro column there. We would be displacing farmland, but we would also be displacing crop, it's feed crop, which has an important role, but it's also loaded with pesticides and pre-emergent. And I just want to put that out there that, the more we kind of neck down the opportunity set, I don't want to create perverse, my perspective, I don't want to create perverse incentives where farmers wind up doing things with their land that may not be environmentally beneficial from other perspectives.
Thank you.
There's a question in there too somewhere, but
is there a question in there? Because I'm happy to.
I'm just trying to make sure that I guess the question is, how do we capture that idea so that this feels less like a regulatory sort of narrowing of the opportunity set versus kind of how do we work together with farmers and solar developers to create the best outcomes for habitat, farmers' bottom line, and still maintain a healthy solar business in Maine.
Sorry, I'm just turning off competing technologies here. Maybe another way to frame this is, and you can decide, Matt, if this addresses your question in another way, and then I'll take you, Ellen, is that I think from what you've received by written materials and what you've heard by presentation, it appears that there are a lot of technical resources in existence right now that have been in existence for a while that are in the best management practices category, I would say. They're technical guidance. They're not requirements. It provides largely freedom to farmers and to solar developers to do what they think is in their mutual best interest. And yet, even with that, there is a perception of mounting pressure on agricultural lands. So if we start with the assumption that what we have right now is not enough, either because it hasn't been communicated broadly enough, it isn't being employed enough, or it's just not enough, then what do you want the focus of your further attention to be during your time together? that's the way I want to sort of put it back to you, because you all know that there are a lot of resources that are already at your disposal. As you sit on that, let me take Ellen's point.
I think I actually mostly have questions, but my two questions are, when we're thinking about the category of incentives, and in some of the chat, there's interest in seeing certain types of projects incentivized, and I'm just, or on certain land categories, development on certain land types incentivized, and I'm just wondering, within the bullets under that first category, sort of where we see those fitting. It may be that you are imagining that is a topic we'll be discussing, but I just wanted to know sort of where that might fit. And the other item that I was wondering if we wanted to think about as a way of incentivizing the siting of projects is actually not through adders or subtractors, but through regulatory efficiencies. Because that is something that I've heard from developers, that actually more important to them than receiving extra compensation for certain types of projects or siting projects in certain ways is actually if they were if they could sort of go through the kind of administrative process more efficiently with a well-sited project, that would actually be worth more to them. So anyway, I was just wondering if that was something that we wanted to talk about as well.
So I'm hearing all of these as suggestions that I'm not sure that there are rock solid answers to, as much as I'm taking these in as ideas that it may make sense to just add to this list, and then amongst you decide how much time you want to spend on, for instance, the topic of a permit by rule process or some kind of a regulatory efficiency process, as opposed to devoting your time to some other topic. Nancy or Selena, did you have any reactions to that in addition to that you wanted to respond to, as far as where you might have seen incentivizing opportunities, for example, fitting within this list of levers?
Looking at it now, I think it could be called out more explicitly, so that those two are ones that we can add to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. Yeah, fortunate.
Joe, looking at this document and the conversation so far, it feels like, and this is a little bit to George's comment previously, it feels like, embedded in here is some sort of hierarchy of how we value the different layers that Sarah showed on her GIS map, but I'm not sure we have been explicit. And I realize there probably are lots of landmines in the process of making it explicit in terms of stacking values against each other, but it does feel like it's important. And certainly for me, who is not a land use expert, I don't know, for example, if the property that Matt just described is one that is considered, prime or soil significance, or would it be, or what category would it be in? And do we think as a group that is less important to protect than a vegetable farm in Arundel or a dairy farm in Monson? And I don't know if we can come to a common understanding, but I feel like it would be useful, because ultimately, these projects have to go somewhere if we're going to achieve our energy goals. And I am totally in support of the idea that we should cover rooftops, parking lots, and brownfields first. That won't get us where we need to go. As Selena said previously, they are more expensive than the alternatives. And so, we need to have some willingness to pay if that's our priority. But ultimately, we're going to use some land. And so we should think about where we want that to be, as opposed to just saying, everything has some reason to be protected. And that's true, but we have to make some decisions, priorities here.
Reactions from the group about that? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of what I see in the document as well. Just I think it would be helpful to narrow our focus on like a PBR, right? The sort of very actionable things where we can start to work together to figure out, to do that balancing. So if you said, for example, I think there's some discussion about doing this permit by rule process now, where you would have a set of criteria for projects that can move more quickly through the regulatory process. That is I think an area where we could say, like, what do we want to, in the context of figuring out what those criteria are, we would have to balance competing goods and decide which projects we want to move forward because they meet certain criteria or don't. And right. So we've been talking about this concept of increasing permit by rule criteria from like 20 acres to 50 acres for solar projects that meet certain criteria. I think that's the kind of thing that could be very helpful and get to what Forshot and maybe what I was talking about earlier too, which is, we really want to come up with good outcomes that balance both of all the good things that we're all trying to do here, like work on a farmer's bottom line, produce clean energy, maybe, and then also like protect particular layers of or types of farmland above others. But doing that through the regulatory process seems like a great one. Doing it through the procurement process seems like a great one. And then I love the habitat, just to point to Sarah's thing, I think the habitat part of that is also critical and will be borne out in could be borne out in both of those processes. Also, like I thought Nick's comment about the decommissioning stuff, we can get answers to that, and I think it would be important as a background.
Thank you. George, go right ahead.
Just a brief note on decommissioning, but to get to before I address a bigger point, we put standards in our ordinance that were designed specifically to deal with risks related to decommissioning without having to resort to massive performance bonds. I'm happy to talk about that anytime at a more appropriate point. With regards to outcomes and land use, I think it's worth maybe providing some awareness to the group of some constraints that I think are interesting in understanding why we have land use pressure on agricultural land, when we have brownfields available throughout the state. Now, I'll give you the worst example I've heard so far. The Great Northern Paper Mill in Millinocket, which not the East Millinocket site, but the original Great Northern Mill in Millinocket, has like 200 acres of brownfields already cleared. It's not forested. It's probably never going to be forested again. Previous industrial use, possible contamination. They can't be used for solar, and they would take solar on that site in a second, especially utility grid, what I call grid scale solar, which is worth, a really good sized project is worth over $100 million. They would take it on that site, but they don't have the transmission capacity to send it to send it out. They still have hydroelectric facilities on the site, and those hydroelectric facilities, in part because there's nothing consuming power there anymore, are sending all their power out of town. So right now, here we are sitting in a group talking about farms getting potentially getting bulldozed over, and forests getting cut down. And we got 200 acres up in Millinocket that can't take solar and can't take anything because they haven't got the transmission capacity. So, I mean, if you're a farmer thinking about why do I have developers calling my phone, ringing me off the hook, to build on my land? Well, the flip side of it is there's communities right now that would take these projects and take a lot of, I think, help take pressure off of the agricultural lands that can't. And so I'm bringing this up right now because we're talking about regulatory mechanisms. And if I was going to propose or encourage any specific regulatory mechanism, it would be one that provided for investments in transmission infrastructure that delivers greater capacity for takeaway to brownfield sites. And that is one of the fastest ways that you can take pressure away from the agricultural and forest lands, is by making the brownfields more viable for development. It's hundreds of acres at a time.
Perspectives on that?
I'll just go ahead, Matt.
Selena, and then Nancy, and then Matt.
I couldn't agree more that transmission is an integral part of all of our work here. I think in a perfect world, if we were able to stop time and figure out how to prepare our grid for this new clean energy, that would be a really helpful endeavor. Unfortunately, we're in this time where we're building it as we are going. And so on the energy side, there are plans in place, both from direction from the Climate Council and otherwise, to do some of that integrated resource planning, to work with the utilities to get more granular information and start planning and developing our transmission and distribution system to better serve our clean energy needs. And so I do think that looking forward, that is something that we do need to plan on. Unfortunately, I don't think that that will be a tool that will be useful in the immediate term, that there is a mix of also bringing in some of this, the other things we're talking about, while also thinking about agricultural in the context of future transmission planning efforts.
Nancy, go right ahead.
Following up on what George said, first, I would add that there are sort of brownfield equivalent farms as well, unfortunately, due to PFAS in the state of Maine. This is an area that I think solar developers should avail themselves of understanding the scope of this. And my bureau is definitely the intersection point on that. So I just want to flag that there is going to be farmland. There is farmland that could potentially become productive solar farms instead. So that's an area for further thoughtful planning. And I like your suggestion, George, about the policy that could support that. I want to just go back to the importance of soils. The definition of prime farmland and farmland of statewide importance is set federally and through USDA NRCS. We have a lot of data about soils and their location, as imprecise as it may be in the state of Maine. And we know that these soils are highly productive for food and forage. That value cannot be understated. And I think it is very useful to use those as guideposts as we consider all of these buckets. I am leery of trying to add value judgments on top of that about farms, whether they are conventional or organic. We have 7,600 farms in this state that are all highly diversified. They can farm how they want. Also, conventional farms can become organic through a transition period. So let's just be cognizant of that as we talk about farms and their capacity. Thanks.
Thank you. Matt, I'm just going to very briefly skip over you just in the spirit of getting more voices into the room, and then I'll come back to you. So Nick, go right ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, it's kind of a response to Matt and also Nancy's comments there. I think anybody who's done their homework on this call has seen some imagery, or perhaps even physically been on what can be remarkable sites. There are some solar sites out there that absolutely add phenomenal ecosystem services to the region they're in, the ecology. But that doesn't just happen. It takes investment. It takes a real, values-based commitment on behalf of the developer, the landowner, the municipality. I sat in on World Bee Day last week to a presentation from one of Matt's colleagues from Long Run Energy, all about the remarkable pollinator habitat that can be put in place on solar sites. But I'm hoping that, as part of it, that's sort of the last bullet on this page 6, that can be played out here in Maine, that when those sites do intersect with agricultural lands, that they are absolutely improving those lands, that we could build that out here in Maine as a real lead for what those sites can be, those ground mounted solar sites that do intersect with ag lands. Because no, it's not all going to be small, under 5 acre, or under a megawatt to meet the needs.
Thank you. Matt, go right ahead.
Yeah, George, I thought the comment about transmission, I think, is one that I wish I had mentioned earlier. Yeah, the market is not efficient in this way. We may want to put projects in places that are good for habitat, good for farming. We want to manage, we want to put them on brownfields or manage them in all kinds of ways. But the developer can only inject these projects in certain locations given the constraints in the power system. So those are not things that we control. And I think we probably want to include an overlay of those issues, because we simply can't, we may really put a dent in the possible, the amount of power that's possible from solar. If we start to overlay too many constraints, we really may start to impact what we can do on the solar side. We already have, by virtue of just adding a lot of generation to particular parts of the system. We can't get that power to market. Tons and tons of renewable projects in Maine are curtailed every day because they can't get their power to market. So really appreciate that comment. I should have made it. My boss will be mad at me that I didn't, but I'm glad you did, George.
No, thank you. Let me just reflect back a couple of things that I'm hearing. Certainly there's been a call out about adding in the issue of incentives. There's been a recommendation to, or a thought around spending some time talking about this regulatory efficiencies issue, whether it's permit by rule, somehow to make things more efficient for solar developers, but in a targeting them toward particular areas. You've raised the issue of focusing more on dual use. And when you think about a way to make the best use of your time over the next 5 months, 6 months, are there other things that jump out to you? Because one approach that we could take is we could spend a meeting or two, for example, on statutory and regulatory approaches, and then just sort of explore that in greater detail. We could do the same thing around best management practices / technical assistance, whatever you want to call it. What isn't being done sufficiently in that regard? We could do the same in regards to incentives. Or we don't explore all of that because you just want to leave something off the table and you'd rather hone in on some very specific actionable items. So reactions to the approaches moving forward and the specifics that have been identified so far. Yes, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I think a goal of how to use our time, from my perspective, is somewhat to what Fortunat was saying before, is recognizing what we value. And I think if we can determine what that is, then really focusing on how to get to that end, whether it's through regulatory or incentives. So when Emily was speaking before about what soil looks like after decommissioning, to me, that's the way that we can have both. We can have, large scale solar development now to meet the energy office goals and our state's goals for energy production, but we can also still have that ag land. So we figure out what the soil looks like 30 or 40 years from now, and then incentivize a process of getting to that point.
Yes, go ahead, Fortunate.
I was going to save this comment for a later conversation about decommissioning, but I just want to make it quickly, which is, I don't have a crystal ball better than anyone else's, But my expectation is that the overall renewable energy need in the state is not going to be lower 30 years from now than it is today. And as Matt and others have said, grid connection is one of the most valuable pieces of these projects. So yes, we expect, power density of plants to go up over time, and maybe alternative technologies will show up that have a lower land footprint, but I do not think we should expect large amounts of land to return to other uses from solar at the end of the first generation of life. Maybe it will happen, but I'm not sure we should build a policy around it.
Understood. And it may shift, the properties may shift, but it may not reduce. It's unlikely to reduce. So I see Selena and Caitlin and Ellen, and I don't remember what order that came in. So I'm just going to take you all in that order, if that's okay.
I wanted to go back to one of, I think, some of the themes that I hear coming up about the hierarchy of what problem we're solving here, as opposed to what the solution is. And I heard Nancy's point about we don't want to, there are some ways where we can't value one farm over the other, but I wonder if, I guess I'll just put it out there, do we feel like we have a sufficient understanding of the problem that we're solving, or is there either now or next time a conversation around valuing the land that we're talking about, or how the hierarchy in some way in terms of the solution, in order to get to the mechanisms to solve this problem, this potential problem? So it's more of a question.
Yeah, do you mind if I hold on you, Caitlin, for a moment, just to get reactions to that, and you as well, Ellen, unless you want to respond to that. But I do think it would be helpful for all of us who are kind of planning each of these meetings to get a sense of that. Nancy made a point about, we're here because of prime farmland and soils of statewide importance. Do we need to be more specific around what the problem is that we're trying to solve? Caitlin, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of building off of what Selena's raising here, because I think you were right, Jody, in characterizing that there's a lot of resources already out there for identifying and placing like the initial value judgment on sites of whether it's prime soils or forested lands. Like those mapping tools exist and can be very useful. And I completely agree with Nancy's point that we want to avoid placing that further value judgment on different kinds of farming. But to the point of Sarah's analysis that she showed and what Evan was presenting earlier, there's a lot of projects already in the works. And all of these projects are already close to transmission lines, and we're going to need to figure out how to deal with those projects that are already proposed on these lands. And I think there's that kind of inflection point where a project is already proposed, but it's still kind of being developed in conversation with the town, in conversation with the landowner and the farmer. And we can do a better job of providing more resources to those stakeholders to know what to ask for from their developer, and how to kind of raise the bar for standards on doing dual use, on providing those ecosystem services and pollinator planting, so that every project that's already proposed, whether it's on land that's valued more or not, we're really getting the most value out of that project and making sure that, this development that's already underway is adhering to kind of this higher standard that I think all of us on this call want to see.
Ellen, go right ahead. Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Fortunat sort of addressed this as well. I mean, I think from the perspective of that, a solar project may not end in 25 to 30 years. But I just also wanted to raise that I don't think I think at least some of us on this call don't feel like, it should be sort of open season on any agricultural land, and that we just preserve, our sort of agricultural sector for the future. I mean, I think it's an important segment of Maine's economy. One of the recommendations that was included in the packet from the updated climate action plan is about increasing the amount of food consumed in Maine by state food producers. And I think that's a really important goal as well. especially to create food security for our state and our region. And so, you know, to me, this isn't a question of, you know, which one are we going to choose? Because they're both really important for different reasons. And so to me, the question is really, how do we, you know, sort of create the right levers so that both are growing, but in ways that don't sort of cancel out each other or like, you know, impact each other to the extent that we're really significantly reducing the viability of one sector or the other. Mm-hmm. And I think I liked your proposal of like the different categories of topics that we can be addressing. Because I think those do provide sort of a variety of different choices. But so anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen. George, go ahead.
You know, based on what I've heard so far in terms of what do we do with our time in the next meeting, one of the things that seems to come up is permit by rule and also brownfields. I think Nancy's got a really good point about PFAS on farms. And I absolutely think this group should consider a permit by rule process for PFAS contaminated farms. And I would also include industrial brownfields as well. There's no need to do a massive amount of permitting on a known and documented industrial brownfield. And I feel the same way about a farm. And I think that that could be one good way to sort of address it, is instead of what is it that we're trying to protect, it's what is it that's contaminated and where can we encourage a development? And so, you know, you let the market forces play out. You know, you let the market forces play out. Give these developers incentives to look, you know, show them not where you don't want them, but show them where you do want them, and send them in that direction. And I think that'll take considerable pressure off of some of the farms. The other thing that kind of comes to mind on Pat's point about residential development and subdivisions and using solar farms to try and preserve that. As a municipal official, I would be concerned about, you know, sort of, it's really a home rule question. You know, the municipalities are responsible for if they want to have zoning, where their zoning is going to go and where they're going to allow a single family home low density development and where they're not going to allow it. And I think that addressing those pressures at the state level is going to bring in a lot of questions and concerns from the municipalities about home rule. I don't have them here. If you want to build a bunch of housing here, great. If you don't want to do it and you want to have a wide open wilderness, which we have plenty of, that's fine too. But in Hollowell, I know it's a totally different question. I know it quite well. And I think that, you know, my concern I would just add that should we be addressing residential pressures and trying to deal with residential pressures that way? I would say no, because I think it's an end run around the home rule process that's natural to all municipalities. And I think it's unfortunate that we can't address development pressures on open spaces this way. But I think that it could end up being a significant distraction later on.
Thank you, George. I'm going to take a break for 1 second to take a look at the list of attendees. So these are public members who've been listening in. And for those in that category, if you could just press the raise hand button if you had hoped to make a public comment, so I can get a sense of how many of you there are and how much time we need for that. So just looking at the attendee list, we've got 19 folks listening in, and anyone wanting to make a public comment, if you could raise your hand. Ethan, I should be able to see that, right? Or are you, I'm not seeing any raised hands, so I just want to make sure that I'm able to see something.
You would be able to see it, and I'm also watching and don't see any hands going up. So
okay, all right, good to know. Fine if you all want to change your mind, but it just allows me to see how much time we need to reserve for that. Let me keep this conversation that we have been having then open still. More reactions. I've heard, for instance, Ellen saying that she did sort of like this, you know, 3 major buckets area and delving into each of them. George is, you know, advocating for a considerable focus on permit by rule and pointing developers into areas where you really do want to see development happening to the extent that it's possible based on transmission corridors. Other thoughts about that? One question I had for you, and this is maybe putting you on the spot, Emily, is my limited understanding of the work that you've done with other states is that there may be models of certainly approaches that other states in New England have pursued that may be ahead of Maine, and maybe I'll ask that of you as well, Ellen, or anyone, frankly. But I'm just wondering if, we can have technical resources provided to you by mail. We can have brief speakers at future meetings. In terms of who, I see a lot of you on this call as among the most informed on this area. So it may very well make sense in the same way that Sarah presented to have others of you present if it will advance your conversation. So let me turn it briefly to you, Emily, about your work in other states that might be helpful.
Sure, thanks, Jody. Well, certainly Massachusetts, I think with the SMART program is the most established and has gone through a review and an update of some of the regulations, both for the full program and the agricultural generation, the dual use program within it. I think there are some lessons there that we could absolutely learn from review of policies and guidelines. There is certainly work in Vermont. I'm less familiar with the Vermont work, but I think that there is probably, again, some policy work that we could look at. I think that, Connecticut is likely to go through a process of change soon, and New Hampshire is probably a little bit behind that. So if this group wanted some Massachusetts and Vermont examples of various pieces of citing or of policies around it or guidelines, I think that's something that I could certainly very easily provide. I also have some of the resources around considerations and examples of dual use that AFT put together with our partners for the New England Smart Solar Siting Partnership that I'd be happy to share. Sort of thinking back to an earlier comment from Ellen, are the definitions of these terms that we're going to be using for the next 6 months, we have to make sure we have a common understanding, and dual use is often one of those that is most broadly different depending on what state you're talking to, what sector you're talking to. But if that's something that would be helpful to look at examples, both within the US, and there are some really great examples internationally as well of what dual use looks like and what's possible. It's also something I'd be happy to provide and support.
Great, thank you. And just so you all know, kind of the pattern of what will happen moving forward is this planning team of Selena and Nancy and Yvette and Ethan and I will meet sort of to have a debrief call a couple of days after each one of your meetings to plan the next meeting based on your input. So we will talk about that, Emily, and certainly get back. I'll get back to you on that. So thank you. Any other perspectives on information that you would find helpful to have at your disposal prior to the next meeting? Yes, go ahead, Matt.
Just quickly, I think there is a bit of draft rulemaking language. Maybe Selena, you're aware of this on the PBR front that we could share. I think Nick Lipsey's been working on that, and a couple of other folks, maybe Nancy, Selena, you guys are involved. But I think that's a great example of using sort of the tools that we've got available to us to kind of guide for outcomes or solve for outcomes. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for mentioning that. I just wanted to say we do have our state agency colleagues involved and teed up, so we're happy to let Nick and others from DEP know of this interest. Nick was unable to be here today, but I'll certainly revert back to him about that. Similarly, we've notified IFNW, LUPC, PUC, others. So, I can't commit on their behalf, but they know this is happening. And so if there's data or information or presentations, whatnot, we will certainly gather that as we go forward.
Thank you. So I'm not sure who raised their hand first, but I'll take Sarah and then Ellen.
Thanks. On the dual use, I'd like additional information on what I think maybe it was Matt who mentioned DEP concerns about grazing for nutrient loading. I've also heard some folks talking about compaction and possible changes to stormwater calculations from DEP. So I don't know if that's a piece we could bring in from DEP's perspective on what dual use is. Another piece that, and I'm not quite sure exactly what I'm asking for here, but I'd like a better understanding on the financials. I know that I looked really deeply into the SMART program and their incentives, and I heard a lot of the feedback when they did their review a couple of years ago now from the development community, that the incentives just weren't anywhere close to what would get them where they needed to be. And so I don't know who that would be that can supply some of that information, but how do you calculate that tipping point for incentives, financial incentives to shift action?
Got it. Okay. Ellen, go right ahead.
I totally want to echo what Sarah said about the financials piece. That would be really helpful information to have, and sort of then figuring out the balance with what Selena mentioned, which is sort of cost to ratepayers, which is also an important consideration. The other thing I was wondering about, just for sharing purposes, is sharing the citing criteria that was included with the DG procurement. That might be sort of interesting for folks to take a look at, in addition to some more information like we discussed about the 14 projects that went through the first tranche of the RPS procurement.
Great. Okay. Nick and then Nancy.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to second Sarah's comment about asking for more information regarding DEP concerns around what I think is phosphate loading with some proposed activities on some sites in Maine. And to me, it's linked to the first question under on page 7 under identifying potential solar site and levers, design best practices. I think that I lean on Department of Ag for all kinds of things, particularly some BMPs around agricultural activities of my own here in Maine. And I know Nancy's getting some contact from all kinds of folks who some asking who's in charge of this. DEP's got regulatory, Department of Ag's got regulatory. I think it would be good to understand if we are going to be designing best practices or suggestions for best practices. It would be helpful for me to understand who has the oversight on some of these proposed solar sites and why. That's a huge can of worms, but it's one that in the farm and ag community there's back and forth on Department of Ag, DEP, and the tension there, or the challenges there of regulating and guidance on solar sites, ground mount solar sites. So where would our recommendations be going?
Well, just to be clear, your recommendations would be going to the Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry for it to do with it what it believes best. But your point is well taken. And oh, sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
Thanks, Nick. I definitely think that it would be useful to have DEP be a prime presenter in the next or soon to be next meeting about their role in permitting. They really are the prime permitting agency when it comes to state solar development for projects over 20 acres, which will trigger site plan review. And then depending on the site, there could be NRPA and of course stormwater. And stormwater right now, the Chapter 500 rules there are something that they're looking at relative to grazing. And that is something that our department is actively talking to DEP about. And I am very hopeful that we will be moving forward expeditiously in a way that everyone's comfortable for solar grazing. But I hear you with respect to the role of DEP, and I'll certainly ask that they can be participatory going forward. I just wanted to say my interest too, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the role of municipalities and their experience to date in the drafting of solar siting ordinances, et cetera, the interplay with current use taxation, concerns around that. Perhaps MMA would be willing to partner in a conversation around that. And obviously, being from a state agency, that's where kind of my focus lies a lot, but amplifying and understanding what's happening on a municipal level would be really helpful.
Great. And then you're seeing, thank you, Caitlin, you're seeing her comment in the chat about providing, she could provide cost information about different dual use models. So I think we'll follow up with you on that, Caitlin. Thank you. And not picking up the rest of the thread here yet, but we'll read this afterwards. Let me switch back over to attendees, given what time it is, and have a last call for public comment. If you want to raise your hand, and we'll take you. Okay, going. Okay. Great. So let me pivot to just where, we chose 2 meeting dates that made sense for 5 people and for the legislative calendar for the most part. Obviously, we lost one individual, and we'll hope to have Jeremy back for the next meeting. But general feedback about meeting scheduling, if there are particular constraints that you believe the planning group should be aware of, if you want to just email me directly about that. We will plan to have a meeting basically once a month between now and the end of the year. As I noted in the meeting packet, for the foreseeable future, it would be remotely, and we would certainly seek your input as to whether you wanted to and you thought it was practical to meet in person at any point in the future once that state policy allows for that. I want to, so I'm going to be I know even before our debrief call on Monday that Nancy and Selena and Ethan and Yvette and I will have, that I will be reaching out to you, Emily, to you, Caitlin, and I have it on the radar to think about what's the best way to pull in DEP information, either by presentation or by written information or both. I will certainly post all the meeting dates when we have them. And the goal would be to provide all of those prior to the next meeting, so you can get them on your calendar well in advance. Final thoughts about anything that you would like to share before we wrap up and you want to make sure that the planning team takes into consideration when it meets on Monday? Okay. All right. Well, then as I said at the beginning of the meeting, all first meetings are sloppy because we don't exactly know what we're doing yet, and we're making it up as we go. And the point is to make sure that we're making it up as we go with your input. So we'll report back out sometime probably the end of next week or the beginning of the following with much more information. And it may very well be that we come up with sort of a draft idea to get your input if we're even still a little bit concerned that we don't have enough feedback from you. Yeah, next meeting Thursday, June 24th, 9 to noon, same day of the week, same time frame, 3 weeks from now. Thank you all. Really good to meet you. Okay, you have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jody. Bye, everyone.